There's a tropical island in the middle of the Indian Ocean that you're absolutely forbidden from visiting under any circumstances whatsoever, no matter who you are. It appears on no tourist maps, commercial flights don't fly anywhere near it, and unauthorized ships entering its waters are intercepted by military vessels. The island has pristine beaches, crystal-clear lagoons, lush vegetation, perfect weather year-round, and absolutely zero civilians allowed to step foot on its shores. Diego Garcia is one of Earth's most strategically valuable pieces of real estate, home to a massive U.S. military base that decides wars across 3 continents. But this island paradise was inhabited by an entire community of people until Britain secretly evicted every single one of them to make room. The Chagosians lived on Diego Garcia for generations, raising families, running coconut plantations, speaking their own Creole language, building a complete island culture. Then between 1968 and 1973, the British government forcibly removed all 2,000 islanders and dumped them in slums in Mauritius, without compensation or warning. Their dogs were gassed and burned alive to terrorize them into leaving. Their homes were bulldozed, their possessions were abandoned on beaches and destroyed. Britain told the world Diego Garcia had no permanent population, calling the Chagosians temporary contract workers, despite living there for 5 generations continuously. The United States built one of its most important military bases on the emptied island and has operated from there for over 50 years. Here's what makes this impossible. You can't just erase an entire indigenous population from their homeland and pretend it never happened legally. International courts have ruled Britain's actions illegal. The UN has demanded the island's return, and Britain simply ignores these rulings with American support. The Chagosians have been fighting for 60 years to return home, and Britain keeps finding new legal tricks to prevent their repatriation permanently. Meanwhile, the Diego Garcia military base launches bombers that drop thousands of tons of explosives across the Middle East and South Asia routinely. This is the story of how 2 Western democracies committed what human rights organizations now call crimes against humanity for one military base. In 1958, a U.S. Navy officer identified Diego Garcia as the perfect location for a military base to project American power across the Indian Ocean. The island sits almost exactly equidistant from the Persian Gulf, the Horn of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, creating unmatched strategic positioning for operations. From Diego Garcia, American bombers can reach Tehran, Baghdad, Kabul, and Mogadishu without needing permission from unstable regional governments who might refuse access. The problem was simple. Diego Garcia had a population of indigenous people who'd lived there since the late 1700s, under French and then British rule. The United States requested an unpopulated island to avoid political complications with newly independent countries asserting sovereignty over former European colonial territories everywhere. In 1960, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara held secret conversations with British Minister of Defense Peter Thornycroft about acquiring the Chagos Islands. Britain was withdrawing its military presence east of the Suez Canal due to economic collapse and needed ways to maintain global influence cheaply. The devaluation of the pound in 1967 forced Britain to abandon expensive overseas commitments, but Diego Garcia offered a low-cost power projection solution. If Britain provided the island, America would lease it for military operations and give Britain discounted Polaris nuclear missiles worth millions of pounds. It was a classic Cold War trade. Britain kept strategic relevance through American power while America got a critical base without the political headaches. In November 1965, Britain illegally carved the Chagos archipelago out of Mauritius, just before Mauritius gained independence from British colonial rule entirely. This created the British Indian Ocean Territory, a brand new colonial possession specifically designed to house military facilities, without civilian populations interfering with operations. Britain paid Mauritius £3 million and promised to return the islands when no longer needed for defense purposes, a promise never kept. The separation was accomplished through administrative decree without parliamentary oversight, effectively recolonizing territory during the decolonization era, which violated international law principles. Mauritius had no real choice. Accept the payment or risk Britain delaying independence indefinitely, which the colonial power threatened explicitly in negotiations. The key to making this arrangement work was convincing the United States that Diego Garcia had no permanent indigenous population to remove or relocate. British documents called the Chagosians transitory contract laborers, despite families having lived on the islands continuously since the late 18th century under French rule. The Chagosians were descended primarily from enslaved Africans and Malays brought to work coconut plantations, plus some Indian laborers who arrived later voluntarily. By 1965, about 2,000 Chagosians lived across the archipelago, with the majority on Diego Garcia, where they'd built homes, schools, churches, and cemeteries. They spoke Chagosian Creole, practiced Catholicism, operated fishing boats, harvested copra from coconuts, and had developed a distinct island culture over 6 generations. Britain assured the United States there was no indigenous population, just plantation workers who could be easily relocated without political or legal complications arising. This lie was essential because international law was evolving to protect indigenous peoples' rights to their ancestral lands during the decolonization period globally. If the Chagosians were recognized as indigenous people with land rights, removing them would violate emerging international norms. Britain publicly supported elsewhere, hypocritically. So British officials simply redefined the Chagosians out of existence on paper, calling them temporary migrants despite centuries of continuous habitation proving otherwise. The U.S. State Department accepted Britain's assurances without investigation because an unpopulated island solved enormous diplomatic and legal problems for American military planners. The eviction happened in 3 calculated phases, designed to terrorize the Chagosians into leaving, while maintaining plausible deniability of forced removal internationally. Phase 1 began in 1967 when Chagosians who traveled to Mauritius for medical treatment or family visits were simply prohibited from returning home. No advance warning was given, no compensation was offered, and families were split apart, with some members stranded in Mauritius, while others remained trapped. Chagosians returning from trips were told the ships wouldn't take them back to Diego Garcia, and they should find accommodation in Mauritius somehow. This created immediate hardship as stranded islanders had no money, no housing, no jobs, and no support in Mauritius where they were treated as unwanted refugees. Phase 2 involved creating artificial scarcity on Diego Garcia through import restrictions that made remaining on the island progressively more difficult and unbearable. British administrators stopped shipping in essential supplies like food, medicine, and building materials, forcing islanders to depend on diminishing plantation stockpiles running out. The coconut plantations were deliberately run down and closed, eliminating the only employment available, and cutting off the islanders' income sources completely. Without work, Chagosians couldn't afford to buy the limited supplies still available, creating poverty where previously the island had supported comfortable subsistence living. The goal was making life so miserable that Chagosians would voluntarily leave, providing Britain with plausible deniability about forced removals later in courts. Phase 3 was pure terror. British and American officials ordered all pet dogs on Diego Garcia to be rounded up and killed in front of their owners. The dogs were gassed, shot, and burned alive in sealed sheds while Chagosians watched helplessly, creating trauma designed to break community resistance to eviction. Homes were bulldozed with possessions still inside. Churches were dismantled. Cemeteries were abandoned, and the physical infrastructure of Chagosian life was systematically destroyed before their eyes. These orders were given by British Commissioner Sir Bruce Greatbatch and executed by U.S. naval construction battalions, who treated it as routine demolition work. One Chagosian woman recalled, "Life was easy. It was like paradise. And that's when the nightmare started, when we realized we couldn't go back." The final eviction was completed with the 1971 Immigration Ordinance, which prohibited any Chagosian from entering or remaining on Diego Garcia under British law. The last Chagosians were forcibly loaded onto ships in October 1971. Their belongings were left rotting on beaches, and they were dumped in Mauritius. Most arrived homeless and destitute in a country they'd never lived in, speaking a different Creole dialect, with no housing, no jobs, and no government support. Mauritius treated them as unwanted refugees, providing minimal assistance and forcing families into corrugated iron shantytowns without running water or electricity for decades. Some Chagosians were sent to Seychelles instead, where they faced similar poverty and discrimination from local populations, who resented the sudden refugee influx. Meanwhile, the United States began constructing one of the most sophisticated military bases on Earth, on the emptied island, starting in January 1971. The Navy's Seabees built deep-water port facilities, extended the airfield to handle B-52 bombers, constructed massive fuel storage tanks for refueling operations globally. Diego Garcia became a floating fortress in the middle of the ocean, completely self-sufficient, with power generation, water desalination, satellite communications, and supply depots. By 1977, Naval Support Facility Diego Garcia was officially established with full operational capability to support American military operations across the entire Indian Ocean region. The base expanded dramatically during the Cold War to track Soviet submarines and serve as a logistics hub for potential conflicts with the USSR. Diego Garcia's strategic value proved itself repeatedly during every major American military operation, from the 1,990 seconds through today, without interruption or political complications. During the 1991 Gulf War, B-52 bombers flew over 217-hour missions from Diego Garcia, dropping 800,000 tons of bombs on Iraqi forces. The island's distance from Iraq meant bombers flew round-trip missions lasting nearly a full day, requiring aerial refueling over the Indian Ocean repeatedly. Unlike bases in Saudi Arabia where local politics restricted operations, Diego Garcia operated with zero restrictions because no local population existed to complain about noise. The base allowed America to conduct devastating air campaigns without navigating complex relationships with Middle Eastern governments who feared domestic political backlash from hosting strikes. After the 11th of September 2001, Diego Garcia became the launchpad for the invasion of Afghanistan, when regional allies refused to allow U.S. bombers to operate. Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia all declined American requests to use their airfields for combat operations against Afghanistan, creating operational difficulties for Pentagon planners. Diego Garcia solved this problem instantly. B-1, B-2, and B-52 bombers flew directly from the Indian Ocean island to Afghanistan without requiring anyone's permission. The base hosted over 4,000 military personnel at peak operations, supporting round-the-clock bombing campaigns that lasted for months without logistical interruptions ever occurring. One B-1 bomber crashed shortly after takeoff in December 2001, but the crew survived and operations continued without missing a single scheduled strike mission. The 2003 Iraq invasion repeated the pattern, with Diego Garcia serving as the primary staging area for American bombers attacking Iraqi targets repeatedly. Maritime prepositioning ships stationed near Diego Garcia carried ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and supplies that could be rapidly deployed to the Persian Gulf when needed. The base provided something invaluable: guaranteed access that couldn't be revoked by nervous regional allies facing domestic pressure against supporting American military operations. From Diego Garcia, the United States could wage war across the Middle East and South Asia, completely independently of regional political dynamics or international opposition. No parliamentary debates, no popular protests, no diplomatic negotiations could shut down operations from an island with zero civilians to object or complain. Diego Garcia has also allegedly functioned as a CIA black site, where terror suspects were detained and interrogated outside any legal framework or oversight. Multiple investigations have found credible evidence that Diego Garcia housed secret detention facilities during the War on Terror, though details remain classified officially. The island's isolation and complete military control made it perfect for activities governments wanted to keep secret from courts, journalists, and human rights monitors. No independent observers can visit Diego Garcia. No press can investigate. No lawyers can inspect, creating a legal black hole where anything could happen unobserved. The British and American governments have repeatedly denied using Diego Garcia for extraordinary rendition, but declassified documents contradict these official denials consistently over time. Today, in 2025, Diego Garcia remains one of the two critical American bomber bases in the Indo-Pacific region, alongside Guam's Andersen Air Force Base. The island monitors vital shipping lanes carrying 2/3 of the world's oil through the Strait of Hormuz and Malacca Strait choke points that global commerce depends upon. B-52 bombers stationed at Diego Garcia can strike targets in Iran, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, or the South China Sea within hours of receiving orders. The base hosts sophisticated surveillance equipment, submarine facilities, satellite communications, and prepositioning ships ready to deploy anywhere across 3 continents rapidly when crises emerge. Military planners consider Diego Garcia irreplaceable. No other location provides such strategic positioning with guaranteed access, completely free from political interference or local opposition. Meanwhile, the Chagosians have spent 60 years fighting to return home against relentless British legal obstruction and American strategic interests blocking their claims. In 2000, the British High Court ruled the evictions illegal and granted Chagosians immediate right to return to all islands except Diego Garcia itself. The British government immediately overturned this ruling administratively, then appealed until the House of Lords reversed the High Court decision in 2008, favoring the government. Britain created a marine protected area around the Chagos Islands in 2010, banning all fishing to prevent Chagosians from returning and establishing sustainable livelihoods. WikiLeaks cables revealed British officials explicitly stated the marine park would make it impossible for Chagosians to pursue resettlement claims by eliminating economic viability completely. In 2019, the International Court of Justice ruled that Britain's continued administration of the Chagos Archipelago violates international law and decolonization obligations binding on all states. The United Nations General Assembly voted 116-6, demanding Britain return the islands to Mauritius and allow Chagosians to return home. Britain dismissed the ICJ ruling as non-binding advisory opinion and refused to comply with the UN resolution, continuing military operations without legal interruption. The United States supported Britain's position because losing Diego Garcia would force Pentagon planners to negotiate base access with countries that might refuse or impose restrictions. Mauritius offered to lease Diego Garcia to the United States for 99 years if Britain returned sovereignty, but America feared future Mauritian governments might revoke access. In May 2025, Britain finally signed a treaty transferring sovereignty over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius after years of international pressure became diplomatically unsustainable. The agreement allows Britain to maintain exclusive control over Diego Garcia for at least 99 years with renewal options, keeping the military base operational indefinitely. Critically, the treaty explicitly prohibits Chagosians from returning to Diego Garcia, even though it's their ancestral homeland, where most families historically lived for generations. Mauritius agreed to this restriction because maintaining American support required guaranteeing the base's future without civilian populations that might complicate military operations through legal challenges. The Chagosians were excluded from negotiations entirely, their voices ignored, their rights dismissed, and their homeland permanently closed to them by foreign governments. Human Rights Watch released a report in 2023 accusing the United States and Britain of crimes against humanity for their treatment of the Chagosians. The report documents racial persecution, forced population transfer, apartheid-like policies, and ongoing denial of indigenous peoples' rights to their ancestral territory spanning 6 decades. The man who originally proposed the Diego Garcia base, U.S. Navy official Stuart Barber, spent his retirement writing letters urging compensation for the Chagosians. Barber admitted there was never any good reason to evict Chagosians from the northern islands 100 miles from Diego Garcia, where they posed zero security risk. He wrote, "The U.S. will justifiably be held guilty as the most obvious beneficiary of evading responsibility or compassion for the human damage inflicted." Today, thousands of Chagosians live in poverty across Mauritius, Seychelles, and Britain, still fighting for their right to return home after 6 decades of exile. Many have died without ever seeing their homeland again. Graves are buried in Mauritius instead of ancestral cemeteries on Diego Garcia, abandoned and overgrown. The children and grandchildren of the original evictees are now leading the fight, having never walked on soil their parents and grandparents described as paradise. They've organized advocacy groups, pursued legal cases through every available court, lobbied international bodies, and demanded justice from governments that refuse to acknowledge wrongdoing. The Chagosian Creole language is disappearing as elders die and younger generations assimilate into Mauritian society. losing connection to their unique cultural heritage forever. Diego Garcia continues operating exactly as designed, a fortress island with zero civilians to object, protest, sue, or complicate military operations through political pressure. The base is nicknamed the Footprint of Freedom by the U.S. Navy, due to the island's shape and its role in projecting American power globally. It's also called the Unsinkable Aircraft Carrier, a permanent platform that can't be sunk, captured, or politically compromised by governments changing alliances or policies unexpectedly. At any given time, 3,000 to 5,000 American troops and civilian contractors live on Diego Garcia in comfortable housing, with recreational facilities, including beaches reserved exclusively. The island offers pristine snorkeling, sports facilities, dining options, and shopping that make deployments pleasant for military personnel, enjoying a tropical paradise stolen from its owners. The strategic logic is brutally simple. Diego Garcia provides America with guaranteed military access, immune to democratic accountability or international law constraints that limit operations. If the base were in Kuwait, Parliament might vote to restrict operations. If in Saudi Arabia, protests might force closure. In Oman, political changes could revoke access. But Diego Garcia has no parliament to vote, no citizens to protest, no domestic politics to navigate, no alliances to maintain, no diplomatic complications whatsoever. It's the perfect military base precisely because it was emptied of humans whose rights, needs, and voices might interfere with strategic objectives, requiring flexible force projection. Every bomb dropped from Diego Garcia, every surveillance mission flown, every submarine deployment supported happens because an entire people were erased from their homeland first. The two democracies that claim to champion human rights, international law, and self-determination violated all three principles to maintain one military base without accountability. Britain and America ignored court rulings, dismissed UN resolutions, excluded indigenous peoples from negotiations, and continued denying Chagosians their basic right to go home. The legal gymnastics required to justify this are extraordinary. Britain claims sovereignty while acknowledging the ICJ ruling that sovereignty is illegal creates obvious contradictions. Mauritius now technically owns the archipelago, but agreed to ban Chagosians from their own homeland to satisfy American military requirements. Britain negotiated on America's behalf. The 2025 treaty is being marketed as decolonization, but it's actually the opposite. Permanent colonial control disguised as sovereignty transfer through legal sleight of hand. Diego Garcia reveals something universal about how national security justifies any crime, if strategic interests are large enough to outweigh moral considerations completely. The eviction wasn't a tragic mistake or unfortunate necessity. It was a calculated decision that powerful governments could commit atrocities without facing meaningful consequences ever. 60 years later, nobody has been prosecuted, no officials have apologized, no compensation has matched the harm inflicted, and the Chagosians remain exiled from home. The base is more important than the people. Strategy trumps justice, military necessity overrides indigenous rights, and power determines whose suffering matters to governments making decisions. You can visit almost any island on Earth if you buy a plane ticket and arrange transportation. But Diego Garcia remains absolutely forbidden forever. Not because it's environmentally protected or scientifically restricted or culturally sacred, but because two governments decided one military base matters more than 2,000 people. The Chagosians wanted to fish their ancestral waters, maintain their coconut plantations, raise children in the same houses their parents were born in. Instead, they got barbed wire, military patrols, legal prohibitions, and permanent exile, while bombers fly overhead carrying explosives to distant wars they never asked for. This is how empires actually work when you strip away the rhetoric about democracy, human rights, and international law that governments invoke selectively when convenient. Diego Garcia is the most important US base you can't visit, because visiting would require acknowledging the people who used to live there and were systematically erased. And acknowledging them would mean confronting a crime that continues today, every day, as long as the Chagosians remain exiled from their stolen paradise permanently.